Please stand by. We're about to begin. Good day and welcome to the SSRC Implications of Statewide Job Losses on Child Well-Being conference call. Today's presentation is being recorded. At this time, I'd like to turn the conference over to Ms. Chris Moore. Please go ahead, ma'am.
Hello, I'm Kristen Moore, Senior Scholar at Child Trends and a member of the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse team. Thank you for joining this webinar on the implications of statewide job losses on child well-being by emerging scholar Dr. Anna Gassman-Pines. Next slide, please. Just depicts the SSRC, which is a virtual portal of research and resources related to self-sufficiency. The SSRC also functions as an online community for professional networking related to self-sufficiency, employment, and family and child well-being. Next slide shows an overview of the SSRC. Of course, the purpose is to disseminate quality research. We currently have over 2,614 items in our library and are constantly adding new publications. The SSRC is designed for researchers, practitioners, and policymakers and includes several interactive features in addition to the library. The next slide. We have the library and every item. It shows the 12, on the last slide showed every item, the 12 topics, and every item is reviewed for relevancy. The new Browse Topics feature enables users to view research by topic that has been highlighted and recommended by the SSRC library team. The SSRC events calendar includes information on in-person and virtual events that are relevant to the field of self-sufficiency. Make a Linkage tab contains a directory of organizations or stakeholders in the field, such as foundations, nonprofits, public agencies, that can be browsed and filtered by audience type and topical area. Organizations can register themselves with the SSRC and will be sent the SSRC badge or logo to be featured on their website. This is not an endorsement, but rather another way to promote professional connection and conversation. Finally, My SSRC is a feature that will be rolled out in the next few weeks. Through this feature, SSRC users will be able to select a number of topics of the 12 listed on a previous slide that are in the SSRC. From there, users will receive 4 resources per topic that have been recently added to the SSRC in an email. Research will only be highlighted that was published within the last 2 years. Turning now to the emerging scholar. Please feel free to nominate someone to be an emerging scholar. Our selection criteria include they must be a graduate student or a degree recipient who has no more than 10 years experience, and that's a maximum. We're looking for people who are early career. Someone who's currently doing research on self-sufficiency issues, and this is defined by the 12 topical areas. And someone who's conducting high-quality research that fills a knowledge gap or addresses a self-sufficiency issue that warrants greater visibility. They can be working in an academic setting, in a program setting, in a think tank, or an agency setting. And we want to emphasize they don't need to be a researcher in an academic setting. They could be in another setting as well. So today, our emerging scholar, and this is for the term from January through March 2014, is Dr. Anna Gassman-Pines. She is an assistant professor of public policy at the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. She holds a PhD from New York University in Community Psychology in 2007. Her research interests are shown here: low-wage work, social policy, gender, economic inequality and poverty, family life, welfare, and employment policy. So very much in tune with the goals of the SSRC. And her recent work can be found in the SSRC library. As Anna speaks, please remember that you can ask a question anytime during her talk. You can submit a question through the question and answer feature, which is on the bottom right of your screen. Questions will be collected during the webinar and answered after Dr. Gassman-Pines' presentation. And if we run out of time, questions will be answered and the responses will be posted on the SSRC with other webinar materials after the event. Now let's turn the mic over to Dr. Anna Gassman-Pines.
Thank you very much, Chris, for that introduction, and thank all of you for tuning in today. I'm very pleased to be having a chance to present my work about the implications of statewide job losses on child well-being. Just to start by giving you an overview of what I hope to accomplish during the talk today, I'll start by providing some background about statewide job losses, economic downturns, and why we might expect effects on child well-being. Then I'll describe the background and methods on the current study. Next, I'll present results on the effects of job losses on youth test scores. Then I'll present results on mechanisms that might link job losses to youth test scores, and I'll conclude by discussing some implications for policy. So the recent Great Recession was the most significant economic downturn since the Great Depression, and the Great Recession really highlighted the importance of understanding implications of recessions for child well-being. Previous research has not focused systematically on children, but has provided information about adults and how recessions might affect adults. So how do recessions or local job losses affect adults? First of all, there's overwhelming evidence that losing a job has negative effects for adults. So when adults lose jobs, they experience decreased lifetime earnings. So not only decreases in earnings that are immediate at the time of the job loss, but actually looking long-term over an individual's lifetime, those who have lost a job actually earn less over the lifetime than those adults who haven't lost jobs. Additionally, losing a job leads adults to have physical health problems, including pain, headaches, and other physical health symptoms, and mental health problems, including increased reports of stress and increased serious mental health problems such as depression. There's also evidence that local job losses in the community also affect adults who do not lose jobs. That is, living in a community where many other adults have lost jobs has effects on the adults who remain employed. Local job losses decrease adults' earnings. So you can imagine, for example, a waitress who works across the street from a large factory. If that factory closes and moves jobs overseas, that waitress herself may remain employed, but her earnings could be affected because, for example, fewer customers are coming in to that restaurant for lunch, and so she receives fewer tips. And so although she maintains her job, she actually earns less due to the job losses that have occurred in her community. Additionally, local job losses increase adults' feelings of economic anxiety, so feeling worried or anxious about both individual and community-wide economic well-being. And local job losses increase reports of stress and mental illness among those adults who remain employed. So how does job loss affect children? Well, first, when parents lose jobs, children are affected. So having a parent who loses a job has been shown to increase children's grade repetition, or the chance that a child is held back in school, has been shown to decrease older children's GPAs in high school, and leads to increased behavior problems in school. So things like getting in trouble, being rated by teachers as having worse problem behavior, and even getting suspended. But a question remains, what about children whose parents remain employed but who live in communities where many adults have lost jobs? That's the question that I'll be providing some information about today. So one question is, how might community-wide job loss affect children? There are a number of potential pathways. I'm showing you here just a few, but When a significant number of adults in a community lose jobs, you might imagine that that leads to structural changes to communities themselves. So changes in the communities that will affect all children who live in that community. So, for example, when a significant number of adults in a community lose jobs, you could imagine that there are decreased funds available for schools, so the education system itself might have lower amounts of funding available for those students in that local school district. You could also imagine community-wide pressure increases on social service agencies to address the increased anxieties and stresses of people in that community. And that pressure on social service agencies could have effects on all children who live in that community. You could also imagine some changes that occur within schools specifically that in response to community-wide job losses. So teachers themselves may feel more stressed. They could be among, for example, the adults who remain employed but experience increased stress in response to local job losses. And schools may have more disruptive peers in the classroom because of the job losses in the community. And finally, changes to families might help explain how community-wide job loss affects children. So families may have decreased income and increased stress, and those could lead to changes in child well-being. So my research examines economic downturns in each of the 50 U.S. states. So over the last 2 decades, each state has had its own economic downturns in different years. Sometimes these occurred at the same time as national recessions or economic downturns, but in some states, for state-specific reasons, that state itself experienced a downturn even when other parts of the country were not experiencing one. And my research seeks to answer 2 main questions. First, do changes in state economic conditions lead to changes in the academic achievement test scores of children in that state? And second, what mechanisms might help explain changes in test scores? One thing to think about in looking at relationships between states' economic conditions and students' test scores are 2 issues related to thinking about whether these relationships may or may not be causal. So if you find a correlation between the state economy and state-level test scores, we might want to interpret that correlation as causal, but we may be cautious about doing that for 2 reasons. First of all, we might worry about reverse causality. So we might worry that, for example, in a state that has, in general, poor quality education, children in that state graduate from high school without skills to succeed in the workforce, and employers look around and think, oh, the youth coming out of the schools in this area are not good workers. We should relocate to a place where we can have better skilled workers. So that's a case of reverse causality, where it's not job loss leading to worse test scores, but actually the opposite, that the worse test scores and worse educational performance of students actually led to job loss. The other kind of concern we might have is concern about omitted variable bias. So we might worry about omitted variable bias in a case, for example, of an area that has high levels of youth drug use, which leads to poor schooling outcomes for youth in that area, and high levels of youth drug use also lead employers to decide to relocate because they worry about the low quality workforce in that area. So in this example, it's high levels of drug use that lead both to poor schooling outcomes and job loss in that area, not that job loss leads to poor schooling outcomes. So how might we get around these kinds of concerns? The approach that I'm going to talk about today is to use job losses that are a shock or a surprise to people in that community because they occur unexpectedly. So when businesses close, they do not want to tell workers or customers in advance that they are going to close because they might lose business. If a business announces in advance that they're planning to move their jobs overseas, they might lose business before they've actually closed. So in general, businesses try not to make a big announcement in advance about jobs that they are planning to move elsewhere. And so when businesses do close, those closings and the loss of jobs are a surprise to workers and community members. And so subsequent links from those job losses that occur unexpectedly due to business closings to children's outcomes can be considered closer to causal effects on children's outcomes. So now I'll turn to a description of the current study. Data on job losses come from the U.S. Department of Labor's Bureau of Labor Statistics. And in particular, I used data that the Bureau of Labor Statistics gathers on mass closings or layoffs. And what they define as mass are events that affected 50 or more workers that last longer than 30 days. The Bureau of Labor Statistics gathers this information across all 50 states and starting in 1995, and we use data through 2009. And this data on mass closings or layoffs includes two measures of statewide job losses. The first is total initial claimants, or the number of people who went into a local unemployment insurance office to apply for unemployment insurance following a job loss. And the second is separations, which is the actual number of people who lost jobs. And separations is gathered by the Bureau of Labor Statistics actually going back to employers and following up with them in a survey about how many workers lost jobs in that particular closing or layoff event. This figure shows you the minimum and maximum workers who were separated from jobs through a mass closing or mass layoff as a percent of the working age population in that state. And here, working age population is defined as ages 25 to 64. So the light gray bars are the maximum in each state, and the dark gray bars are the minimum in each state. And what you can see is that there's quite a bit of variability across states in terms of the biggest job losses that the state experienced over this period. And so, for example, the highest maximum was in Alaska in 2009, so that's as a result of the Great Recession, but not all of the job losses occurred during the Great Recession or during other recessionary periods. The next biggest, Louisiana, is due to Katrina. So that one represents job losses following Hurricane Katrina. But importantly, many states, as you can see, had 1 year during which they experienced job losses that affected at least 1% of the working age population during that year. Data on test scores come from the National Assessment of Educational Progress collected by the U.S. Department of Education, and this data is sometimes referred to as the nation's report card. These data are also collected across all 50 states about every other year over the period 1996 through 2009. And this data contains representative samples of 4th and 8th grade public school students in each state and provides state averages overall and by important demographic subgroups. So our approach is to use regression models using data on each state over time. We include in our models state fixed effects, which adjust for any constant differences between states over this period. So the fact that some states rely more on manufacturing than others will be adjusted for by including these state fixed effects. The fact that some states are in general more economically distressed than others will also be adjusted for by including state fixed effects. We also include year fixed effects, which adjust for anything nationwide that occurred in a particular year. So any federal policy that went into effect that might have affected workers across states would be adjusted for by including the year fixed effects. And finally, we combine the two measures of job loss to improve the precision of the estimates. So next, I'll describe for you the results of the effects of statewide job losses on youth test scores. What we find is that statewide job losses decreased 8th grade math test scores, but we found no effects on 8th grade reading scores or on the test scores of 4th graders. The declines in 8th grade math test scores were found across demographic groups, so these declines were found for both boys and girls and for white, black, and Hispanic students. So this figure gives you a sense of the size of the effects. So what this figure shows is the effect of statewide job losses to 1% of the working age population on 8th grade math test scores. The bars go down because we predict that test scores go down following job losses. And the units here are in standard deviation units. So the overall effect for all students was just about 8% of a standard deviation decline in 8th grade math test scores following job losses to 1% of the working age population in that state. As you can see, the effect looks fairly similar in size for both girls and boys, and fairly similar in size across racial and ethnic groups. There's some evidence that non-Hispanic black students may have experienced larger declines in their 8th grade math test scores, although we can't say for certain that that's much bigger. It is certainly suggestive that black students may have been more affected than students in other groups. And just to give you a sense of comparison, this pink bar shows you the typical difference between children whose parents lost jobs and children whose parents remain employed. So these overall effects are not of the same magnitude as the studies that have focused specifically on the effects of parental job loss on children. Nevertheless, they show that they are quite sizable considering that this is test scores across the state and looking at job losses across the state. The size of the effects, importantly, are too large to be driven only by the children who are directly affected by parental job loss. So the size of those bars can't be attributed to simply aggregating up the relationship between the aggregate number of parents who lost jobs and the aggregate test scores of those children. The size is just too large to be explained only by children whose parents lost jobs. And so the size of the effect provides some evidence of spillover to children whose parents remain employed. Next, I'll present the results on the potential mechanisms. So recall that the first kind of mechanism I talked about was structural changes to communities that might result from job losses and that would be expected to affect all children in those communities. And so one question is, do states and school districts spend less money after large job losses? It may be that education funding can help explain the relationship between job losses and 8th grade math test scores. Our results show that statewide job losses actually do not affect state or local education funding. However, they do affect federal education funding by increasing federal education funding. So this actually works in the opposite direction than you might have expected. And we think this is some evidence that the federal government provides increased education funding as a compensatory mechanism for increased economically disadvantaged student need in those states following job losses. I also suggested that another mechanism that might link statewide job losses to student test scores is increased teacher stress and disruptive peers in school. Unfortunately, data are not available to directly measure these types of mechanisms, but what we can measure is student behavior. And it's possible that changes in schools could lead to general disengagement from school and kind of a downward spiral of behavior that starts in schools and leads to worse math test performance. The measures of student behavior come from the CDC's Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance data. The CDC collects these data both nationally and in states who agree to partner with the CDC to implement state-specific surveys. And 45 states have partnered with the CDC in this effort. The youth risk behavior surveillance data is gathered roughly biannually over the period of study. And when the CDC partners with states, they generate estimates that are representative of high school students in each state. And these data are the source of widely reported statistics on teenage drug use, on sexual risk-taking, and other risk behaviors. So if you see a report in the news, for example, about something like alcohol use is at a 10-year low, it is likely that that statistic was drawn from these data. We looked at 7 measures of student behavior. In the category of drug and alcohol abuse, we looked at youth self-reports of ever having used alcohol and ever having used marijuana. In the category of risky sexual behavior, we looked at youth reports of ever having had sexual intercourse. And then among those who had had sexual intercourse, the number of recent sexual partners and whether that youth reported having used contraception the last time he or she had sex. And in the category of violent behavior, we looked at whether the student reported having carried a weapon to school in the last year and whether the student reported having been in a physical fight in the last year. And what we found for effects on student risk-taking behavior is that job losses actually make students less likely to have ever used alcohol, with no effect on the use of marijuana. There was no relationship between statewide job losses and whether students had ever had sexual intercourse, but job losses appeared to decrease the number of recent sexual partners and increase the use of contraception the last time a student reported having sex. And there was no relationship between statewide job losses and the 2 measures of violent behavior. So just to show you what these look like in graphical form and to give you a sense of the magnitude, again, these are effects of statewide job losses to 1% of the working age population on student risk-taking behaviors. And as you can see, job losses to 1% of the working age population are predicted to decrease the reports of ever having used alcohol by about 2 percentage points. Among those who have had sex, job losses to 1% of the working age population decreased having had 2 or more recent sex partners by about 5 percentage points, and increased the use of contraception at the last time the student had sex by about 12 percentage points. So statewide job losses actually appear to lead to improved behavior, not worsened risky behavior. So a downward spiral of behavior does not appear to link statewide job losses to 8th grade math test scores. But it should be noted that these findings are very consistent with evidence for adults that health-related behavior improves during economic downturns. So among adults who remain employed when there's an economic downturn, health-related behaviors improve. The next mechanism that I examined was changes in family income. So wondering whether declines in family income could account for the math test score drops. To answer this question, I used census data to look at state poverty rates over time and found that statewide job losses increased the percent of the state population in poverty. So job losses to 1% of the working age population are predicted to increase the poverty rate by about 0.9 percentage points. And this evidence is consistent with decreased family income as a potential mechanism linking these statewide job losses to 8th grade math test performance. And then the final mechanism that I'll talk about is changes in stress. So the youth risk behavior surveillance data also asked students about suicidal ideation, suicide plans, and suicide attempts. These are obviously very significant and serious markers of stress, but changes in these suicide-related behaviors could certainly be markers of stress in youth. What I found is that statewide job losses were associated with increased suicide plans in the past year. So job losses to 1% of the working age population were predicted to increase suicide plans by 0.83 percentage points, with no effects on, no statistically significant effects on suicidal ideation or suicide attempts. So again, this is some evidence that stress may play a role in helping explain relationships between statewide job losses and math test scores. So just to summarize the findings on the mechanisms, the evidence shows likely paths through decreased family income and increased stress. Changes in risk-taking behavior do not account for the math test score declines. Like adults, youth have healthier, not worse behaviors during economic downturns. And although this isn't a mechanism linking statewide job losses to 8th grade math test performance, it is an interesting result in its own right. And finally, changes in education funding do not appear to account for the math test score declines. And I'll conclude the talk by just briefly discussing policy implications from this work. So one policy implication is that these results may lead us to rethink efforts to ameliorate the effects of job loss. Efforts to ameliorate the negative effects of community-wide job losses tend to focus on adults who have lost jobs by, for example, providing funding for retraining of workers or providing funding for extended health care benefits for workers who have lost jobs. But our results suggest a need to look beyond those who are directly affected by job loss and to include both children and adults. And so one type of strategy are so-called place-based policies, maybe promising policy strategies. Place-based policies are policies that treat communities themselves as the unit of policy intervention. So rather than thinking about policies that target individuals, place-based policies target communities and think holistically about community supports and needs as a way of helping to improve the lives of all individuals in communities. Pardon me. Implications, these findings also lead to some implications for public education. So local economic conditions may affect schools' abilities to meet proficiency targets that are set by No Child Left Behind. The federal No Child Left Behind Act sets proficiency targets for all schools. And you can imagine a school that's right on the edge of meeting their proficiency targets. If that school happens to be in an area or a state that all of a sudden experiences a large job loss, that change in the economic conditions of the school's community may make the difference between the school meeting the proficiency target and not quite making the target set for them. And not meeting proficiency targets can have real implications for schools and for school districts. So one thing to think about whether policymakers should take changes in the economic context into account when they're assessing school success and when thinking about whether or not, for example, to sanction schools who haven't met proficiency targets, it may make some sense to think about whether changes in the economic context could have played a role. So thank you very much for listening, and I really look forward to the question and answer session.
Thank you very much, Anna. It's a very interesting talk, and as someone who works at Child Trends, I'm really interested in the effects on children. That's an important topic. So we have some questions for you. One is, why do youth and adults have healthier behaviors during an economic downturn? Do you have thoughts on that from your own research or from research you've read?
That's a really, really good question. So, and the answers may be slightly different for youth and adults, but focusing particularly on youth, I do think that that there's evidence that youth notice when there are job losses in their communities. So even if they themselves are not in the workforce, and are not even maybe thinking about being in the workforce just yet. This is certainly something that's visible and noticeable to youth, and it really may change the way that they think about their future. So it may change, for example, the way they think about their future options for employment. So I live in North Carolina, and North Carolina historically has relied a lot on manufacturing, particularly textile and furniture manufacturing. And you can imagine a scenario where everyone in a county was going to be able to work at the local textile mill, and then when that mill closes, it really changes the way that high school students, for example, might think about their ability to get a job going forward. And so in response, one thing that youth might do is really kind of try to stick to the straight and narrow, to try to make better choices or different choices that are going to perhaps put them on a different trajectory. In other work that's focused specifically on North Carolina, we find, for example, that Black teens are less likely to give birth following job losses in their communities. And so it seems like there's evidence that this is really noticeable to adolescents, and that it might change the way they think about their future options and lead them to try to make healthier choices that are potentially going to put them on a more successful path in the future.
Thank you. We've got a couple of questions about the math and reading scores. One is, why did math and scores change but not reading scores? And the second question is there a greater cost involved in teaching math education as opposed to reading, which could explain the decrease in math scores? So I thought you could talk about those together.
Yeah, those are really good questions. So in terms of why the 8th graders' math scores were affected but not reading, I will say a couple things. First of all, this is consistent with a broader body of literature that tends to find that that environmental context and youth environment tend to have larger effects on math than reading. So this isn't specific to job losses per se. One reason for that may be that reading skills are much more cumulative. So the skills tend to build on each other over time, and so in a particular testing situation, students may be able to kind of rely on the accumulation of knowledge in reading, whereas math skills in some sense are more specific, that each grade level is trying to master a particular set of skills. And certainly there's some accumulation of knowledge, but there are also many highly specific new skills that are being introduced in a particular year. And it may be harder to, when the environment has changed, in particular when it's become more stressful, it may be harder to isolate those recently learned skills, for example, than the skills that have been accumulating much more consistently over time. And so that's one potential reason why math may be affected more than reading. I think this is a really good question about whether it's more costly to teach math. I mean, we certainly know that that teachers feel more comfortable teaching reading than math in general. Even math teachers often wish they had more skills around successful teaching of math. And so it may be more costly, and so that when states and districts are trying to think about how to use their resources, I could certainly imagine a scenario where the math instruction ends up being more impacted than the reading instruction.
Interesting. Well, a couple of questions also on the teen sexual behavior. If you could discuss the findings on sexual partners and frequency of contraception, and consider, do you think this might be part of the explanation for the decline in the teen birth rate in this time period?
That's a really good question. So, right, so we find that following job losses, there's no change in sexual activity. So it's not that we find that youth become more likely to initiate sexual activity or less likely. That the rates of ever having had sex don't change. But what does change is among those youth who have decided to initiate sexual activity, following job losses, they're much less likely to report having had sex with multiple partners recently, and they're much more likely to report having used contraception the last time they had sex. And so, again, this goes back to the story of, I think there being some evidence that youth are really trying to make choices that are going to put them on a better life path, that they do have some sense of how their sexual behavior might lead to different life circumstances in their future. And I think they are trying to make choices that are going to improve their adulthood going forward. It's hard to say whether this may explain the declines in teen births. I mean, certainly the teen birth rate's been declining, over time, and one, I'm not sure if this is the whole story, but it certainly could be part of the story that as outsourcing has become a reality in a lot of communities, as manufacturing jobs have been moved overseas, that in those areas, youth have been really thinking about making different choices about what their futures are going to look like, and this may be part of the story.
Interesting, very interesting. We have a follow-up question about reading and math. The note is that reading and math engage different parts of the brain. Is there a connection between emotionality of job loss and reading and math parts of the brain?
Wow, that sounds like a really interesting follow-up study for me. I'm not sure I can speak to that in particular, but I do think, for both adults and youth, there is certainly evidence that these job losses are stressful events. That evidence is quite consistent, has been consistent over time, and we do see it here using the youth risk behavior surveillance data, looking at some of these suicide-related behaviors. That certainly stress is playing a role, and I could imagine that if stress processes and the kind of neural mechanisms underlying stress processes are differentially related to reading and math skills, that you could imagine that being a potential mechanism here.
Yeah, an interesting thing to think about. It implies sort of a direct effect. So a couple of questions about other employment trends. What about the effects of long-term unemployment, and what about job gains?
Yeah, those are two really really good questions. So, and just to be clear, this particular study does not address long-term unemployment. That is certainly a really important issue, and one that's currently a very important policy issue for our country. What I am talking about here are sudden changes. So you can imagine things are kind of going along, and then all of a sudden, in a particular state, a significant number of people lose jobs. Now, what happens to those people going forward, whether they are able to get reemployed or not, is another follow-up study, not part of this particular analysis. You could imagine, though, that there would be ongoing community-wide changes resulting from having large numbers of long-term unemployed in a particular area. And you could think of a whole set, I could think of a whole set of community and social changes that would follow, changes in long-term unemployment. So I can't speak specifically to that, but I think this is suggestive, potentially suggestive, that that could have consequences going forward. And in terms of job gains, so a couple ways to think about that. One is there is a whole body of research across disciplines, particularly in economics and some in psychology, showing that people actually react much more strongly to losses than they do to gains. And this is different, all types of losses and gains, but certainly applicable to job losses and gains. So losses are viewed much more negatively and occupy much more of people's minds than do gains, even when they are of the same magnitude. So I think losses are important in and of themselves because of this importance, kind of psychological importance that they have for people, and how kind of distressing they are, and the fact that they're not necessarily offset in terms of people's perspectives and views by gains. So that's one important point. The second is in many states and communities, even when there have been gains, they have been in different industries and for different types of people than the losses. So the gains don't necessarily offset the losses in terms of whether they facilitate reemployment for the directly affected individuals, and whether they enable communities kind of as a whole to recover given the mix of skills that are in and kind of workforce characteristics in those communities.
Interesting. A question about the ages of the children. This is a story about adolescents. The question is, what about younger children? Have you or have others looked at that?
That is a really good question, and I will say that you know, this work has relied heavily on existing both existing data sources, administrative data sources that tend to do more data collection on adolescents and older children. I think there's a real reason to think that very young children in early childhood, or say birth to 5, might also be very strongly affected by these community-wide changes and job losses in their states and communities. I can't speak to that today, but I will say that you know, given what we know about all the important changes that are happening during the early childhood period, the rapid brain development, and the evidence that, for example, poverty has very large impacts when children experience poverty during early childhood, I could really imagine that if we were able to look across developmental periods, we would really see important and significant impacts on young children that would just add to the body of evidence that thinking, you know, broadly about how to ameliorate the effects of job losses should include children. It would, you know, just only add to the evidence base there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And here's a question about the adolescent childbearing again. Do you believe at all that there may be a connection between better decision-making with adolescents undertaking sexual activities, that might be partially explained by parents being more available and there being more supervision during a time of job loss?
That's a really good question, and I know of work done by others using, for example, the American Time Use Survey that does show that following job losses, in particular when parents lose jobs, they do spend more time with children. So it's possible that there's more kind of direct parental monitoring of adolescents that's happening following job losses, and that maybe parents are able to engage in different ways with adolescents following job losses to either kind of directly monitor their behavior or to support them in making different decisions and choices.
Complex patterns here.
Yeah.
A question about data. Why did you opt to use the YRBS data, youth risk behavior surveillance data, instead of suspension expulsion data collected by school districts and states?
That's a very good question. So we wanted to use the YRBS data because we thought it would provide us with information about behavior problems and behavior change both within and outside of schools. So the YRBS asks a number of questions that are specific to schools. So they enable us to look at things like, for example, having carried a weapon to school or having been in a physical fight in school, but they also enable us to look more broadly at youth risk-taking behavior that might happen in school but might happen outside of the school context. So it's a way of getting information about youth behavior and risk-taking that cuts across contexts.
Okay, turning back to a question about unemployment. Have you looked at how the receipt of unemployment insurance might factor into these patterns?
That is a really good question, and it's something that we're starting to work on now. And you could certainly imagine that receiving unemployment insurance could buffer these relationships between job loss and declines in 8th grade math test scores. And states actually do vary quite a bit in the generosity of their unemployment insurance programs, both in terms of the maximum benefit that individuals can receive, as well as the length of time that people who have lost jobs can receive benefits, and that's what we're starting to look at now. So I don't have an answer yet, but I do, given the links that we find through, or the evidence of links through family income and stress, I think there's a, I strongly suspect that that in states that are more generous with their unemployment insurance benefits, you'd expect there to be more buffering of this negative relationship between statewide job losses and 8th grade math test scores, as as that benefit is able to support both income and presumably to reduce stress.
Okay, one last question, which is whether the research points to a period of time or a tipping point where joblessness starts to have serious impacts for children and youth.
So we've thought a lot about this tipping point question, and we've looked quite a bit for a tipping point, and both in the statewide analysis that I've presented today, as well as in North Carolina specific work that we've done, we actually don't find evidence of a tipping point. What we find is that any amount of job loss, that it really does look quite linear, that the more job loss there is in a community or in an area, the worse things look, particularly for 8th graders' math test performance. And there doesn't seem to be any particular threshold that a state needs to get to, that this really does seem to be really a linear pattern of the more job losses, the more we expect those 8th grade math test scores to decline. In terms of a period of time, this work can really only talk about job losses that have occurred in the last few decades. So it's possible that job losses occurring earlier in the 20th century, for example, had different effects on communities and on children, and I can't speak to that. But what I can say is that this is certainly recent evidence that at least during the recent past, these statewide job losses are linked to important declines in 8th grade math test scores.
Well, great. Thank you very much, Anna Gassman-Pines. And we really appreciate this. Is a very timely and important talk, and I think you've got a long-term research agenda ahead of you.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
And I want to remind our listeners to please take the survey before leaving, and thank you very much for joining us. Bye-bye.
And again, that does conclude today's conference. We thank you all for your participation.